Another thing, Mike, I wanted to get into on this episode, we spent some time early on discussing symptoms of depression and anxiety. I shared some of what I've experienced in hopes of, our listeners and viewers, maybe they can identify with that. But there are a lot of people out there, and I think sometimes, depending on where I am in my journey, I could potentially fall into this category. And I don't know if this is a separate type. You would know better than me as far as diagnosis or whatever, but I've heard the term high functioning depression. And it's where, you're maybe not totally down for the count where you can't get out of bed, but, you're able to function and go through your day. But there's something back there that's bugging you and isn't right. And, it can definitely, I've read some articles on it and I think some irritability and perceived negativity that goes with, those are symptoms of all of these things. But I do think there's a lot of people out there that maybe they read about symptoms and maybe they think, oh, I can get out of bed and go to work every day. I'm not that bad, or I don't suffer from depression. But there is, I think it's considered a diagnosis, the quote unquote high functioning depression, where, people are able to get through their day, but they're not loving it the way they should. They're not, maybe feeling themselves 100% to the way that we would all hope that they could.
Yeah. And I think, Daryl, it's more of that, I've looked at, I look at, and it's not just me. I mean, psychologists and other mental health professionals will look at, challenges and issues like depression and anxiety very similarly on a continuum. So it's a continuum, and everyone will fall somewhere on that continuum somewhere, that with the emotion and the feelings associated with and the signs and symptoms of depression and or anxiety. So, but this is when I talk about a continuum, so I talk about, kind of along that continuum, there could be some mild kind of disruption that happens in my life if I'm feeling kind of down or blue or blah. But depending on how that I'm experiencing that kind of depression, it can move across the continuum of severity, meaning that those feelings and those symptoms that I might be having that start off blues and blahs mild, move across the continuum and get a little bit more moderate. So there's a couple things to remember, and we've talked a little bit about this in our 9 innings, but it's more about how intense those symptoms are that I'm feeling and experiencing. How long do they last, the duration, so the intensity, the duration, and then how frequently do they happen? So how often am I running into these same kinds of things? You talked about this earlier in one of our conversations about, when it came back again, you were like, oh my gosh, here we go again. What am I dealing with here? Sometimes so it's the intensity, it's the duration, how long are these things lasting, and it's the frequency. And so when you talk about high functioning kind of depression, it really kind of speaks to somewhere in that continuum. I'm able to get through, but I'm not necessarily having the zest for life that I normally would, or what I would want to have. And so there are times, and you really hit it spot on, I think a few times, where, there have been times that you shared with our audience that, from the outside, everything looked to be fine and things around you seem to be pretty good, but in the inside, it may not have been. It's more challenging. And that takes great energy. It takes great energy to put on the I'm okay face, even though inside we may not be. And that's really one of the many reasons why we said, hey, I think we can do something here together, and having these conversations over 9 innings or 9 episodes, because it's again, and I'm with you here, Daryl, today it wraps up a complete game, but it's really only the beginning of a conversation we've started over the last few weeks, several weeks since November. And I'm thankful that I've had a chance to do that with you.
Same here, right back at you. And I, you mentioned outwardly everything looks good, but on the inside you can really be battling some things, and they're, they could be different based on the person, certainly. it's really impossible to know exactly how somebody feels about something and what they're experiencing inside. But just as an example, a lot of people that suffer from depression, I think, feel this. You could be in a room surrounded by friends, you could be in your element, and you might be feeling this total heaviness that persists and doesn't go away. That you could feel this like overwhelming loneliness in terms of how you feel, and you can experience that even when you're in a room or a stadium surrounded by people, and it's just the darndest thing. But I think a lot of people can probably identify with that feeling. I think that's probably a common one, but yeah, it's an invisible beast for sure.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there have been times even in my own life where I've been at a level where of just my own kind of stress for what's been going on in my life that presented challenges where I've been surrounded by people that I care about, that are very encouraging and supportive, but I still at times was just really challenged to be fully present in the moment because just my own kind of internal whatever struggles may be going on, the thoughts I may have been having, some of the feelings, whether that be stressed or anxious or even sad and down at times, that happens. And it can happen to any one of us. And that's the part that sometimes, and sometimes we don't even know it. During this pandemic, it's also given us kind of light. And sometimes we go through life and we don't even know how stressed we are. We just keep going through life. But it's, sometimes life can be pretty challenging, and life happens in ways that sometimes we never, ever foresaw happening and predicted. And this year has been, we've talked about that even before we went live today. We talked about the end of 2020, and 2020 didn't have anything to do other than it was a year, but it was the year that had all of these different challenges that have unfolded that will always be associated with 2020. But you and I talked about this before we went on today about just, we both feel that there are brighter days ahead. And part of brighter days is how can we support one another to get there? And the best way to do that is together. So again, we've been able to do this in 9 innings, 9 episodes, covering 9 weeks of time, but it won't be the complete game that ends here today. It's really just the start of a conversation. At least that's what our intent was and our hope. And I remain hopeful.
Exactly. Yeah. And you mentioned the support aspect of it, and going back to that, for someone struggling, that can really, you mentioned earlier, some of the simplest things can seriously brighten somebody's day. And reaching out, checking on somebody that's struggling, I do want to reiterate the importance and how big of an impact, even just a text, even just a simple "how you doing?" checking on you. If there's somebody in your life that is going through that, it's tough to quantify how meaningful and important that can be. I wanted to reiterate that on this final episode also.
No, I think that's a great yes, because sometimes we talked about this, you and I've talked about it all throughout even when we're not, recording, how important some of those small gestures of just taking some time to check in with someone, or just small gestures of kindness. How are you doing? Thinking about you, a text, even a phone call to someone you maybe even haven't really talked to for a while, but an email with the same message, it matters. Some of those small gestures in the end won't be small at all. And people will remember that you took that time to check in with them, to be there, to be present, to let them know that you cared. And, I've called them instant mood changers. And sometimes it starts with just a simple smile. And just checking in with someone. That's one thing that we found in the feedback that we've gotten, and the information that just the feedback from the people within our fellow colleagues in our health system and others that we've supported, what they found very helpful is just that. Sometimes it's the smallest gestures of just checking in, staying connected with somebody, so that they know that someone is there, is present, has their back, and people remember how it makes them feel, and they'll remember for long after the time that you have that sometimes brief smile.
Yeah, yeah. One thing also, Mike, that I think is important to touch on here. There, if you've been in it, if you've been through it, if you've dealt with it, you've probably at some point been told by a well-meaning person to snap out of it, or come on, can't you just be happy? And this is not a knock on people that have said that. That can be a very well-intended and well-meaning attempt. But I want people to understand that, for those dealing with depression and anxiety, we go back to another phrase that I think is one of the very important things of understanding this. It's not a choice. It's an illness. It's a sickness that somebody maybe temporarily, hopefully temporarily, is working their way through, but they don't choose to feel that way. They don't choose to be, withdrawn or a little bit, lax compared to the energy that they typically have. It's not a weakness. It's an illness that they're, again, hopefully temporarily working their way through. But and I don't want to point fingers at anybody, but if you're reaching out for support, be careful and and from an understanding standpoint, it can rub somebody the wrong way when they hear snap out of it or be happy, because they're trying. And I don't mean to, like, I'm trying to find the most gentle way to put that. But I think that's an important thing when you're considering, being there for somebody.
No, I think it's that's spot on. And I think you just said it. I think that you said it the way that you needed to share it right there, Darryl. And I think I'd like to, hit on this part of choice. No one chooses. I've never met anyone says they woke up one day and said, I'm going to choose to be depressed today. That's going to be my mantra of the day. I'm going to choose to be depressed. I've never met anybody. I don't believe I ever will meet anybody that will wake up and say, that's my choice. And so you really hit on that. That is absolutely the case. It's not a choice, but sometimes we naturally run into life struggles. Sometimes we just never had ever an inkling that these things were going to happen. We've talked about this. Sometimes there's some biology and some genetics that are involved that could lead to someone being more, prone to being depressed or anxious. But sometimes it's just life that unfolds in ways that create stress and challenge for us. And then we're just not in our best place. We're not our best selves. And so what is helpful is someone who is non-judgmental, just present, just there to just sometimes be someone they can to be leaned on. They don't even need to have answers. But one of the answers, if it comes out of someone's mouth saying, you just need to, snap out of it, that's not going to be helpful. And you're I think in a very diplomatic way saying, that's not really helpful. But you would not be the only one to say that. And I think your message to me is really loud and clear. This is really not about, can it become an illness? We talk about mental illness. We hear that. It absolutely can be debilitating. You used the word early on in our conversations. It can be crippling. Yes. But I got to tell you, mental health is all of us. We want and we aspire to have good mental health. Sometimes life happens and unfolds in ways that we maybe never had seen or never foreseen. And we then are left with, how am I going to work through this? That's a normal, everyday, can happen to you, can happen to me, type of the way our life stories can sometimes unfold. So it doesn't even ever necessarily mean that mental health or challenges within our mental health or issues leads to illness. It can. But sometimes we don't have to look any further than ourselves and just reflect on the last 9 minutes, not 9 minutes, hopefully not 9 minutes, 9 months, and just take a few seconds and just think about, wow, how have I been doing during those nine months? You're going to inevitably find moments where you were not at your best self. I've not met anyone that's come to me and said, I've been wonderful and at my best self the entire pandemic. And it's not just the pandemic, it's just life in general. We will have moments where we do struggle. And to your point, Daryl, some of the best support that we can get is just to know that we're not alone. But someone saying, just snap out of it is not going to be helpful. And I think even well-intentioned, like you said, you're acknowledging that. Sometimes people are trying to, out of the well-intentioned part of their heart, but it may not, it sometimes may not be received in that way. So good points.
Right. And, everybody can benefit from, the quote unquote safe space, somebody that they can, vent to and not be judged. And that, if you are that support system for somebody, that can go a long way, probably more than words can explain. So, Mike, you and I both, we are huge fans of when athletes speak out on the topic, and more are. But another area where I've noticed that it seems to be very accepted, and hopefully we get to a point where across society it's accepted to talk about it and be open about it. But I've noticed in the music industry, there are so many bands and musicians who some of their great compositions are, kind of their outlet of getting their story out and mental health struggles. So if any of our listeners or viewers are music fans in particular, you probably won't have a very hard time finding a singer or a band that you like, that's part of their story. I've noticed that.
Yeah. No, I think it's, yes, absolutely. I know that there are many musicians and artists that have been open about their stories and their own personal challenges and struggles with their own emotional well-being, mental health, finding good mental health and their struggles along the way. There's an organization called the JED Foundation. So if you Googled the JED Foundation, they've been around for 20 years, dedicated to emotional well-being of young adults and our teens, college-age kids. But the information they share on their website and their resources, very much research-backed, and really apply across the age spectrum. But they do also highlight some of these artists that have been very open and very candid, open conversations about their struggles with mental health. And they're doing that because they want to make sure that people know that just because on the outside they may have seen them be successful, that they also are human. And sometimes they're just not at their best selves, including their overall mental health and well-being. And so they've had conversations. I'll give you a quick example. So, and this is when people say, gosh, does he listen to the, and I do, I appreciate these artists. So, Ava Max is one right now, and Billie Eilish. Those are two that have shared stories recently through the JED Foundation, for example. And there are many more actors, other folks that are in the spotlight, sometimes on, social media as well, that have shared. So it is not just our athletes. I know our conversations here through 9 Innings have focused more on kind of our sports fans and followings and athletes, but there are many others. And the common thread is we're all human. So this applies to each and every one of us, no matter who we are and what we do.
Yep. All walks of life. And I wanted to point that out just because there's more people than, you might even realize that are speaking up on it now these days. And we're definitely getting to a point where it's more accepted. Still some work to do, but I feel like as a society, we're heading in the right direction with it. And